Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the long road leading toward Canterbury, where lanterns glow against the quiet dusk and the air carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Pilgrims move slowly, their footsteps steady, their voices hushed, while inns wait with low beams, straw beds, and flickering candles. These resting places hold the gentle murmur of travelers, sharing bread and stories, as pages turn and shutters creak in the night breeze. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. Henry II of England was not by any measure a restful king. He had a quick stride, a quicker temper, and the sort of restless energy that made courtiers sigh and wish for a slower monarch. Born in the 12th century, he ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Yet for all that power, he found himself locked in an endless quarrel with his once friend Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket had begun as Henry's loyal chancellor, the kind of companion who laughed at the king's jokes and shared his hunting trips. When Henry appointed him archbishop, he assumed things would continue in the same warm fashion. They did not. Becket grew solemn, perhaps a touch theatrical, and decided he must defend the church against royal interference. Henry, not famous for patience, was incensed. The quarrel spiraled, as these things often do. By the late 1160s, the two men were bitter enemies. Henry muttered his famous line, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 knights, apparently thinking this was an actual command rather than frustrated venting, rode to Canterbury and cut Becket down in the cathedral. Chroniclers gasped. The king paled, and the shrine of Thomas Becket soon became one of the greatest pilgrimage destinations in Europe. With pilgrims came inns, and with inns came the endless stories of noble travelers, weary merchants, and humble peasants shuffling along the road. Our journey will rest in those places of shelter where beds creaked, ale flowed, and candles flickered late into the Kentish night. Let's drift over to the earliest pilgrims. They arrived dusty and footsore, moving along the old Roman road from London to Canterbury. Many walked, some rode horses, the luckier few rumbled along in carts. Towns along the way saw opportunity. If people were going to tramp miles to Pruitt Becket's shrine, they would need food, drink, and shelter, and so the pilgrim inns appeared. Usually modest, sometimes grand. These inns were not built for luxury. The aim was a roof, a fire, and a chance to wash mud off boots. Yet some owners grew rich. A steady flow of noble pilgrims meant steady purses of coin. Kings themselves made the journey, Henry II, naturally, to atone for his role in Becket's death. Imagine him, the restless monarch, forced to walk barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, while monks whipped his back lightly with branches. Not exactly the royal holiday he would have preferred, but it kept the shrine's reputation glowing. From there, we meander to the daily life of these inns. They bustled at dawn. Servants stirred the hearth, fetched water, and coaxed horses from the stable. In the common room, bleary-eyed pilgrims gnawed on bread and cheese. Nobles dined separately, often complaining about the draught or the lack of fine wine. The owners of these establishments became minor celebrities in their own right. Some were known for generous feasts, others for rather watery ale. Chroniclers sometimes remarked on both, with a weary sigh. In a quieter corner of the dynasty, queens also made their way to Canterbury. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's formidable wife, was no stranger to long journeys. Though we have no detailed diary of her inns, We can imagine her taste lean toward the slightly more comfortable chambers, perhaps with a tapestry on the wall and a decent mattress. She would have traveled with ladies in waiting, guards and clerks, turning even a modest inn into a buzzing household for the night. We'll shuffle quietly toward another group, the lesser nobles. Knights returning from the continent, squires hoping for advancement, younger sons looking for luck. They brought with them noisy retinues and the kind of loud, brash cheer that innkeepers tolerated in exchange for coins. At night, these men often drank heartily, leaving monks and weary pilgrims to pray for peace through the thin wooden walls. The road to Canterbury thus became not only a spiritual path, but a corridor of gossip, trade, and mild inconvenience. After the shocking murder of Thomas Becket in 1170, Canterbury turned into something resembling a medieval magnet. Pilgrims came from across England, across France, even from far-off Spain. Chroniclers wrote of entire groups walking together, sometimes hundreds strong, all drifting toward the great cathedral, where Becket's body was laid. The shrine glittered with gold and gemstones, but it was the man's story, an archbishop struck down before the altar, that drew them most of all. When people travel, they require stops, and so the inns multiplied. Some were simple farmhouses turned into way stations, with straw on the floor and soup in the pot. Others were built for the purpose, with broad timber frames and the promise of good ale, a phrase stretched thin even in its own day. Let's drift over to the kinds of people who trudged along these roads. First, there were the humble folk, farmers and tradesmen hoping for a blessing, perhaps for health or for a good harvest. They slept in the common hall of an inn, shoulder to shoulder with little more than a blanket or cloak between them and the chill. Snoring was constant, fleas were frequent, and complaints were ignored. Still, the chance to touch the shrine or carry back a token of Becket's memory was thought worth the hardship. Then there were the merchants. These men often brought goods along the same road, so the pilgrimage doubled as business travel. Inns loved them because they carried coin and tended to pay on time. They were also notorious for haggling, sometimes over a single penny, much to the innkeeper's despair. From there we meander to the higher ranks. Nobles came in style, horses decked with fine saddles, attendants carrying luggage, even musicians to soften the long road. They expected better rooms in the inns, private if possible, with a door that actually closed. This was not always available, but innkeepers did their best, for a noble's favor could mean generous payment, or at the very least, protection. By the late 13th century, the pilgrimage had grown so famous that inns near Canterbury itself often overflowed. Imagine arriving after days of trudging only to discover every bed full. Some pilgrims slept in barns, others in the open air, wrapped in cloaks against the Kentish mist. Local farmers, seeing opportunity, sometimes opened their own cottages for a price. Thus the economy of Becket's cult spread beyond the cathedral walls, reaching into fields and villages. We can linger a moment on the cathedral precincts. Here official lodgings grew around the shrine, often maintained by the church. Pilgrims might spend the night in dormitory-like settings, supervised by monks who kept watch with quiet patience. The wealthy might be offered more refined quarters, though still not what they were accustomed to in their own castles. Yet for many, the mere nearness to the holy place outweighed the hardness of the bed. Softly now, another branch of the tale. Literary pilgrims. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the 14th century, captured the diversity of travellers in his Canterbury tales. Knights, millers, prioresses, and pardoners all jostled together on the same road, though in his case, they shared stories rather than cramped rooms. Still, the world he sketched would have been familiar to anyone who paused at an inn along the way. Inns became more than shelters. They were stages. Minstrels sang songs, clerks scratched out letters by dim candlelight, and gossips whispered of kings and scandals. A traveller might learn the latest rumour from London or hear news of battles across the Channel, all while sipping ale of uneven quality and trying not to notice the draught whistling through the shutters. From there, we shuffle toward the nobles who made these journeys particularly memorable. The road from London to Canterbury was not particularly glamorous. Dusty in summer, muddy in winter, and always alive with the sound of hooves and footsteps. Yet, along this uneven stretch of earth, inns rose up like small islands of warmth. Some were little more than timber-framed cottages with a painted sign hanging above the door. Others grew into sprawling complexes, complete with stables, kitchens, and a courtyard for wagons. Let's drift over to one of the most familiar features, the inn sign. Since few could read, images did the work. A painted lion, a bunch of grapes, or the figure of St. George slaying his dragon, all serve to lure travellers. The Tabard Inn in Southwark, for instance, became famous as the gathering point of Chaucer's Pilgrims. From there, the company of storytellers set out, bound for Canterbury. The innkeeper himself, in Chaucer's tale, played host and guide, a reminder of how central these figures were to the life of the road. We'll shuffle quietly toward the stables, for they were often the most important part of the inn. A weary knight might forgive lumpy beds or sour ale, but if his horse was neglected, tempers flared. Inns hired stable boys to fetch water, rub down flanks, and heap hay. The smell, a mix of straw and manure, drifted freely into the night air. Travellers tolerated it. Horses, after all, were the engines of pilgrimage. From there, we meander to the kitchens. Cooking for pilgrims was an exercise in bulk rather than delicacy. Huge pots of pottage grain and vegetables boiled together were ladled into bowls. Bread, often coarse, was served in slabs. Meat appeared for the wealthy or on feast days, but it was not common fare for the ordinary pilgrim. Ale was universal, safer than water, though its strength varied widely. Some inns produced a brew so thin it barely deserved the name. Still, no one lingered on complaints for long. Fatigue softened expectation. In a quieter corner of the inn, noble travellers sought something finer. They often brought their own supplies, spices, wines, perhaps even cooks who prepared dishes in the inn's hearth. This habit made them less dependent on local fare, though it also made them unpopular with innkeepers who lost out on profit. Chroniclers hinted at tension when grand retinues swept in, taking over rooms and expecting deference. But the promise of payment usually eased the strain. Softly now, let's step into the common hall. Here pilgrims gathered by candlelight. The air was thick with smoke, laughter, and the occasional argument. Musicians strummed lutes, clerics read prayers, and storytellers spun yarns of distant places. Some recounted miracles of Becket, while others preferred tales of knights and giants. For a weary traveller, these sounds blurred together, half dreamed before sleep overtook them, on straw mats. The inns themselves became small theatres of human variety. One night might bring a Flemish merchant counting coins, a local farmer mumbling thanks for safe travel, and a French knight muttering about English weather, all of them bound in one way or another toward the glittering shrine at Canterbury. We'll shuffle toward the owners of these inns. They were pragmatic folk, too pious, and they risked losing profit, too greedy, and they drew the ire of local bishops. Some grew wealthy, buying additional properties, even dabbling in politics. Others sank under debt, their inns collapsing into ruin when the stream of pilgrims shifted to another road. Their fortunes, like the pilgrims themselves, wandered up and down with time. Let's drift once more down the road, past hedgerows and fields, where the glow of another inn's fire beckoned across the dark. Each stop was a pause, a shelter, and a whisper of humanity on the long road to Canterbury. By the time pilgrims reached Canterbury itself, the journey had worn them thin. Boots were frayed, cloaks were caked with mud, and tempers often short. Yet the sight of the cathedral's towers, rising above the Kentish landscape, brought a hush. The final stretch was not merely walking, it was arrival. Let's drift over to the precincts themselves. The cathedral complex was vast, enclosed by walls and dotted with buildings that served different functions. Pilgrims filed through gates, sometimes after waiting in long queues. Monks and clerics bustled about, managing crowds that could swell into the thousands during feast days. In the shadow of the great church, inns and guest houses multiplied, eager to catch the weary stream of arrivals. Some inns were tied directly to the cathedral. The Priory of Christ Church, which managed the shrine, maintained hostels for select pilgrims, particularly those of noble blood or ecclesiastical rank. These lodgings were more restrained than luxurious, but they offered a sense of privilege to sleep close to the bones of the saint himself. From there we meander into the common pilgrim hostels. These were crowded, noisy places. Straw mattresses were laid in long rows, and candles burned through the night. Sleep came slowly, punctuated by snores, whispers, and the occasional cough. Still, the nearness to Becket's shrine carried weight. Many pilgrims believed even the discomfort was part of their penance, a small echo of the Archbishop's own suffering. We'll shuffle quietly toward the shrines and offering. After settling their belongings, pilgrims streamed into the cathedral to view Becket's glittering shrine. Jewel-encrusted reliquaries, golden candlesticks, and polished marble dazzled their eyes. Offerings poured in, coins, rings, even land deeds. The wealth transformed Canterbury, enriching not only the church, but also the city around it. Inns and taverns benefited, feeding and housing the endless tide. Softly now, let's pause with the nobles again. Kings themselves came. Henry II, in his penitence, Edward I, with a solemn procession, even foreign monarchs who wished to show devotion. Their entourages filled entire inns, pushing out lesser pilgrims. Chroniclers describe the spectacle of armored knights, banners, and servants flooding the narrow streets. For innkeepers, such visits were a windfall. For ordinary travelers, they were a headache. From there, we drift into the quieter corners, where monks offered hospitality. Benedictine hospitality was not extravagant, but it was steady. Bread, cheese, and ale were provided, along with a blanket for the night. Silence was encouraged, though rarely achieved. Still, many pilgrims cherished these moments of closeness to monastic life, even if only for a night. The city of Canterbury itself hummed with markets, traders, and entertainers, eager to serve the influx. Trinkets bearing Becket's image were sold in abundance. Some inns doubled as shops, their owners hawking souvenirs alongside meals. Others offered services such as letter writing or guidance for those uncertain of the rituals. In this way, the cathedral precincts became a world unto themselves, a place where devotion met commerce, and where every weary guest, noble or peasant, found at least a corner to rest. Among the steady stream of pilgrims, nobles stood out immediately. Their cloaks were finer, their boots sturdier, and their retinues much louder. When a duke or a prince approached an inn, the entire establishment seemed to change shape, as though every beam and bench strained to impress. Let's drift over to the spectacle of arrival. A noble procession clattered into the yard with horses, carts, and a swarm of attendants. Trumpets might not have been officially sounded, but the noise was unmistakable. Grooms ran ahead to demand the best rooms, often to the dismay of lesser pilgrims already inside. There was little chance of refusal. A noble's displeasure could ruin an innkeeper, so straw pallets were shifted, benches cleared, and lesser guests politely, or not so politely, nudged into corners. We'll shuffle toward the eccentricities of noble travel. Some noblemen brought their own bedding, silken sheets packed into trunks that looked absurdly out of place in a timber-framed dormitory. Others carried private cooks, who commandeered the inn's kitchen to prepare spiced dishes with cinnamon or saffron. The smells drifted through the hall, mingling awkwardly with the pilgrims' humble pottage. Chroniclers noted, with dry amusement, the gap between the simple purpose of pilgrimage and the grand appetites of its wealthiest participants. From there, we meander to the entourage of themselves. A single noble could bring dozens in his wake: squires, clerks, jesters, priests, even hunting dogs, inns strained to hold them. Stables groaned with horses, kitchens with demands, and common rooms with laughter that carried late into the night. Servants often sprawled wherever space allowed, while their masters occupied the few private chambers. The effect was theatrical, a wandering court descending upon a quiet Kentish inn for one noisy night. In a quieter corner of the dynasty, noble women made the journey too. Queens and princesses rarely travelled alone. They came with ladies-in-waiting, guards, and sometimes entire households on the move. Their lodgings were carefully managed, often within cathedral precincts rather than public inns. Yet tales survive of high-born women lodging along the pilgrim road, and of innkeepers desperate to provide suitable privacy. A tapestry hastily hung across a room, a borrowed chest used as a makeshift table. These gestures aim to create a semblance of courtly comfort amid creaking beams and smoky hearth. Softly now, let us glance at how locals perceived these visitors. For villagers, the sudden arrival of a duke was both thrilling and exasperating. Markets bustled with attendants buying provisions. Blacksmiths hurried to repair horseshoes. Children stared wide-eyed at glittering armor. Yet the disruption was real. Prices rose, rooms vanished, and noise lingered. For many, nobles were like passing storms, dazzling, disruptive, and quickly gone. From there, we drift to the quieter, humbler guests who shared the inns with them. Imagine the peasant pilgrim, bedded down on straw, listening to laughter and clinking goblets from the chamber above. The worlds coexisted but rarely touched. Still, all were united by the road to Canterbury and the hope, whether whispered or gilded, that St. Thomas would hear their prayers. Queens on pilgrimage added an entirely different texture to the inns of Canterbury's road. While noblemen arrived with noise and swagger, queens moved with ceremony, cloaked in an aura of sanctity and spectacle. Their travel was less about sudden intrusion and more about carefully staged procession. Let's drift over to Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III. Chroniclers tell us she had a taste for refinement. Even on the road, inns scrambled to prepare chambers with clean rushes, hangings, borrowed from wealthier households, and food more elegant than the usual pottage. Her ladies, in waiting, carried linens and tapestries, turning a smoky hall into something resembling a temporary palace. It was theatre, of course, but it kept appearances intact. We'll shuffle toward another queen, Margaret of France, the second wife of Edward I. Margaret was young, pious, and fond of ceremonial devotion. A stop at an inn was never just rest. It was part of her public performance as a queen. Pilgrims watched her prayers with reverence, while innkeepers found themselves hosting not simply a guest, but a living symbol of royal piety. Stories spread quickly. Margaret had knelt here, dined there, perhaps even smiled at a child in the courtyard. For ordinary travelers, it was like brushing against another world. From there, we meander to the smaller details that accompanied these queens. Perfumed oils traveled with them, as did gilded prayer books and fine chalices. Meals included not just bread and ale, but delicate spiced dishes that required imported ingredients. Servants scurried through the inn's smoky hall, carrying trays that looked absurdly out of place beside rough wooden tables. And yet, for one night, an inn might transform into a courtly stage. Softly now, let's pause on the awkwardness such visits created. When a queen required privacy, whole families of ordinary pilgrims were displaced. Rooms were cleared, beds stripped, doors barred to ensure security. The less fortunate travelers grumbled, forced to sleep in barns or under hedgerows while their queen occupied the best chamber. It was, in a way, a hierarchy of devotion. All were headed for Canterbury, but some arrived in silk, others in mud. In a quieter corner of the dynasty, there were dowager queens and widowed consorts. These women often traveled more quietly, though still with retinues. They lingered longer in prayer, sought fewer entertainments, and perhaps drew less attention. Yet, even their presence at an inn carried weight for innkeepers. It was both honor and burden, the sort of night retold in family memory long after the queen had moved on. The pilgrimage road thus became a thread binding royalty to commoners, though never quite in equal measure. Queens prayed at the same shrine, slept under the same roofs, and walked along the same muddy roads. Yet the sheen of status always glimmered, separating their experience from the rest. Not every inn on the Canterbury road was dignified. Some leaned closer to tavern than hostel, their benches filled with laughter, their floors sticky with spilled ale. For many pilgrims, this was not a burden, but a pleasure. The long road was wearying, and a bit of merriment softened the miles. Let's drift over to the gossip that brewed in these smoky rooms. Travelers carried news faster than official messengers. An inn might hear of a skirmish in France. Days before the king's clerks made their announcements, merchants whispered of shifting prices in London, while friars muttered about heresies springing up on the continent. Rumors blossomed like weeds. One traveler swore he had seen relics glowing faintly by moonlight. Another insisted a certain nobleman's lineage was not quite as legitimate as the heralds claimed. No matter the truth, the inn preserved these tales, each retelling thicker with detail. We'll shuffle toward the minstrels. The minstrel could transform a night with a lute, a harp, or sometimes just a strong voice. They filled the common hall with song, ballads of Arthurian knights, of saints performing miracles, or of lovers separated by cruel fate, drifted through the rafters. Pilgrims drowsed beside the fire, half dreaming as the verses wound on. Occasionally, a noble guest paid for a private performance upstairs, leaving the common folk with silence and the sound of dripping ale. From there we meander to the clerks with their quills. Travel required letters of passage, accounts of expenses, or simply messages home. Many inns kept a clerk or at least a literate lodger willing to scratch out words for a coin. The ink was thick, the parchment uneven, but the words mattered. A husband might assure his family he had reached Rochester safely, or a merchant might record the number of bolts of cloth still unsold. For us, these scraps are precious glimpses of ordinary life, preserved by accident in archives. In a quieter corner of the inn, scribes sometimes copied tales for amusement. It was not unusual for a clerk to trade a story for his supper. He would read aloud from a romance or a saint's life, his voice cutting through the haze of pipe smoke. Some listeners nodded solemnly, others chuckled quietly at the more improbable miracles. It was, in a way, the medieval version of bedtime storytelling, perfect for drowsy pilgrims leaning into their cloaks. Softly now, let's step back to the innkeeper's role in all this. They had to balance noise with order. Too much revelry and respectable guests might leave. Too little, and the place seemed joyless. Most innkeepers allowed laughter, tolerated music, and ignored the occasional dice game in the corner, so long as fights did not break out. When tensions rose, usually between tired pilgrims and tipsy knights, a strong servant would intervene, dragging the offenders out into the night air until tempers cooled. From there, we drift toward the sense of community these inns accidentally created. A merchant, a friar, a farmer, and a wandering poet could share the same bench, the same pot of stew, and the same bed of straw, if only for a night. They might never meet again, yet for those hours, they formed a fleeting fellowship of the road. The cathedral awaited them all, no matter their station. For all the noise and bustle of inns, another kind of lodging lined the road to Canterbury, those maintained or overseen by monks. These were quieter, more disciplined places, where the rhythms of prayer shaped the hours. Pilgrims who stayed in such dormitories often remarked on the contrast: the hush of cloisters instead of tavern songs, the smell of incense rather than ale. Let's drift over to the Benedictines, who were especially known for offering hospitality. A pilgrim arriving at a monastic guest house would be met with a bow and a basin of water for washing. The beds were hardly luxurious, straw mattresses, woolen blankets, but the orderliness felt soothing after miles on the road. Monks kept their guests fed with bread, cheese, and simple stews, though the fare improved noticeably when noble pilgrims passed through. We'll shuffle quietly toward the dormitory halls. Rows of pallets were set close together, with candles burning faintly in niches along the walls. Silence was requested, though not always achieved. Snoring was impossible to suppress, and the occasional whispered conversation slipped through the dark. Yet the sense of sleeping under the watch of the monastery carried comfort. If thieves or troublemakers lurked outside, the monks were thought to keep danger at bay, not with swords, but with prayer. From there, we meander to the monks' own nightly routines. Even as pilgrims drifted to sleep, the monks rose for the night office, chanting psalms in the dim light of the choir. Guests, half awake, might hear the low murmur of voices echoing through stone halls. For some, it was unsettling. For others, deeply peaceful. A reminder that life in a monastery never truly slept, but simply shifted from labor to worship to rest. In a quieter corner of this arrangement, the monks also kept records. Guest books of a sort survived from certain abbeys, noting the names of visiting nobles or churchmen. Ordinary folk went unrecorded, but the presence of dukes, bishops, and foreign dignitaries was carefully written down. For us, these scribbles are a rare window into who exactly stopped along the pilgrim road. A French count here, a Spanish envoy there, each name a brief visitor in the long life of the monastery. Softly now, let's pause on the monks' role as mediators. Pilgrims sometimes arrived with disputes, arguments over debts, property, or even insulted honor. Monks, trained in patience, often settled such quarrels before they turned violent. The quiet atmosphere helped. It was difficult to sustain anger while surrounded by chanting and candlelight. To more than once, a feud cooled during a night in a monastic guest house, though perhaps it flared again once the pilgrims stepped back onto the road. From there, we drift to the subtle differences between these guest houses and ordinary inns. There was less laughter, fewer songs, and almost no gambling, but there was a steadier sense of order, and for many pilgrims, that mattered more than entertainment. To rest one night beneath the shadow of discipline was considered part of the spiritual journey. It prepared the heart for the final steps into Canterbury, where the shrine itself awaited. And so, beneath the quiet watch of monks, while candles flickered and psalms echoed faintly, countless pilgrims closed their eyes, surrendering to the strange peace of the road. Though Canterbury was an English shrine, its fame spilled far beyond the channel. Foreigners arrived in steady numbers, adding new voices, new coins, and new complaints to the inns along the way. The road, usually humming with English accents, now caught the rhythm of French, Flemish, and even the occasional Castilian tongue. Let's drift over to the French. They came most often, for proximity made the trip manageable. French counts and their households appeared with banners flying, their horses sleek, and their tastes for wine sharper than the average inn could satisfy. Many a Kentish innkeeper, faced with a noble French guest, found himself scurrying to procure something stronger than the local ale. Chroniclers tell of Frenchmen sighing dramatically at the thinness of English drink, yet staying long enough to empty every jug regardless. We'll shuffle toward the Flemish merchants. Flanders was a hub of cloth trade, and its merchants saw the pilgrimage road as both spiritual path and commercial opportunity. Inns buzzed with their accounts, their measuring rods, their chatter about dyes and wool prices. They carried bolts of fabric, even as they carried relic tokens, blending commerce and devotion in a way that perfectly suited the age. For innkeepers, Flemish guests were reliable. They paid in coin, asked few favors, and occasionally left gifts of fine cloth as payment in kind. From there we meander to the Spaniards, rarer but all the more remarked upon. A Spanish knight arriving in Canterbury drew notice the way a brightly colored bird startles in a grey field. His clothing, his accent, even his manners seemed exotic. Pilgrims whispered about distant Castile or Aragon, wondering how far such a traveler had ridden. For the innkeepers, it was a challenge. Spanish tastes leaned toward richer foods and wines, which the Kentish countryside could rarely supply. Still, a Spaniard at table gave the inn a sense of grandeur, a story retold long after he had departed. Softly now, let us pause on the mingling of languages. The common hall of a busy inn could sound like a marketplace of tongues. French mixed with English, Latin with Flemish. Occasional scraps of Italian gestures bridged the gaps. A raised cup meant fellowship, a shared loaf meant peace. For the weary pilgrim, this patchwork of voices reminded them that the shrine of Becket was not a local matter but a European one. In a quieter corner, foreign clerics sometimes scribbled their impressions. A few wrote letters home describing English inns as smoky, damp, and filled with endless bread and ale. Others praised the warmth of hospitality and the earnest devotion of fellow pilgrims. Their words, preserved in manuscripts, paint a picture of England seen through foreign eyes, half amused, half admiring, always curious. From there we drift to the quiet friction that arose. Foreigners were welcomed, but not always without suspicion. English hosts muttered about French arrogance. French guests muttered about English stubbornness. Still, the shrine had a way of smoothing differences. At the end of the road, all knelt before the same glittering reliquary, their voices blending into a single prayer, however briefly. And so the inns of Canterbury's road became tiny international courts, where accents mingled, coins exchanged hands, and the road itself carried more than bodies. It carried Europe's restless spirit. And just like that, this story closes, but our journey isn't over. The past is full of hidden corners, and the next one is waiting just ahead. Let's lean in and drift into something new. This is the moon towers of Bologna, night lights of a medieval city. When medieval visitors approached Bologna, they often saw something curious before they even entered the gates. Rising above the rooftops were towers, dozens upon dozens of them, pointing into the sky like a forest of stone. By day they cast long shadows, but by night some of these towers gleamed faintly, their upper chambers glowing with lamplight, an improvised illumination that earned them the nickname Moon Towers. In a world without electricity, the idea of towers glowing above a city felt like magic. Yet behind this glow was no miracle, only the eccentric ambitions of Bologna's ruling families, who seemed intent on turning the skyline into a contest of height, wealth, and endurance. The origins of these towers lay in rivalry. Beginning in the 12th century, noble families of Bologna built towers as both homes and fortresses, symbols of status in a city that pulsed with conflict. Each family wanted to be seen, and in medieval Italy visibility was power. To build a tall tower was to proclaim superiority, to cast a literal shadow over your rivals. Some towers soared as high as 90 meters, their stone and brick bodies rising above the crowded streets below. Bologna at its peak may have boasted close to 100 of these structures, giving it the appearance of a porcupine bristling with stone quills. But towers were not only for show. Inside, families lived in stack chambers, climbing steep stairways that wound upward through narrow shafts. The ground floor might hold storage and guards, the middle levels domestic rooms, and the top a chamber with wide views across the city. Defensive in nature, the towers were designed to withstand siege, their upper stories fitted with narrow windows for shooting arrows or dropping stones. Yet in peacetime, they became stages for spectacle. Families hosted guests in upper rooms, where the city stretched below in miniature, and where candles or oil lamps could be placed in high windows to cast a glow across the night. This glow became part of Bologna's strange beauty. In a city otherwise dark, after sunset, the sight of lamps glittering from the towers must have seemed almost celestial. Travelers compared them to stars fallen to earth, or to moons hovering above a rooftop. The tower's light was modest, a few flickering flames carried high into the night. But against the deep dark of medieval streets, it was enough to dazzle. Residents called them Torri della Luna, moon towers, because their glow seemed to echo the pale light of the sky itself. Of course, the glow was not entirely aesthetic. Families who lit their towers after nightfall were making a statement. To shine from above was to assert presence, to remind neighbors of wealth, to broadcast security. A tower glowing at night meant its family was powerful enough to afford oil and bold enough to waste it visibly. In a society where light itself was a form of currency, to illuminate the skyline was the equivalent of throwing coins from a balcony. It was extravagant and necessary and unforgettable. Yet, for the people below, the towers were both marvel and menace. Shadows loomed across narrow streets, and falling debris from construction or conflict could kill passers-by without warning. The towers dominated not only the skyline, but the psychology of the city. Citizens lived in their presence, craning their necks upward daily, measuring the hierarchy of families by the height of stone above their heads. Resentment simmered alongside awe. The towers were symbols of ambition, but also of arrogance, reminders that the city's elite had turned Bologna into a vertical battlefield. Inside the towers, life was less romantic than the glowing skyline suggested. Rooms were narrow, cold in winter, and stuffy in summer. Climbing the endless stairs was exhausting, especially for servants who hauled food, water, and firewood to upper levels. Families often lived under constant tension, aware that the tower was both their fortress and their prison. In times of feud, rival families might attack, forcing defenders to retreat upward, cutting off staircases or barricading themselves near the roof. To live in a tower was to live in anticipation of conflict, with wealth and status balanced uneasily against the possibility of sudden violence. The glow of the moon towers softened these tensions slightly, at least in memory. Chronicles describe the towers at night as almost dreamlike, their lamps casting trembling halos across rooftops. For travelers arriving after dusk, Bologna must have appeared like a constellation turned upside down, its stars embedded in brick and stone. The effect was both eerie and enchanting, a glimpse of modernity centuries before electric light. Yet behind the enchantment lay the stubborn reality of aristocratic pride, each lamp a reminder of rivalry carried into the sky. The towers also became landmarks of identity. Just as Venice was known for its canals and Florence for its dome, Bologna became known for its forest of towers. Poets wrote of their beauty, even as civic leaders fretted about the danger they posed. For the city government, the towers were both advertisement and headache, symbols of prosperity, but also of disorder. Regulations were passed, attempts were made to limit their height, yet families continued to build higher, as though bound by some collective compulsion. At night, the glow of the moon towers softened this rivalry into something almost communal, and citizens might curse the families by day, but by night they could not help looking upward, drawn to the trembling flames that gave the city its strange nickname. Bologna's skyline became theatre, each tower an actor lit faintly against the darkness, each flame a signal of wealth disguised as beauty. And so, the moon towers rose and glowed, their fragile flames trembling against the wind, their shadows stretching long across narrow streets. Bologna's nights were lit, not by civic generosity but by aristocratic rivalry. Yet the result was unforgettable, a medieval city that shimmered like a constellation brought to earth. Drifting further into the skyline of Bologna, the towers revealed themselves, not merely as architecture, but as characters in their own right, aloof, stubborn, and slightly absurd. Each was built to impress, to intimidate, and to rise just high enough above the neighbor's structure to make the point. By day, they stood as fortresses. By night, they glowed faintly with lamplight, the so-called moon towers shimmering like misplaced stars above a city otherwise swallowed by darkness. Life on the ground floor of Bologna was anything but celestial. The streets were narrow, the air thick with the smells of markets, animals and humanity packed into close quarters. The glow above offered no comfort to those dodging chamber pots, emptied from windows or skirting piles of refuse in alleys. The towers might glitter faintly, but the city beneath was a muddle of noise, barter, and complaint. That perhaps was the point. From above, the noble families could imagine themselves above the stench, above the noise, living in rarefied air, perfumed with oil and smoke. The tower's construction was itself a feat of stubbornness. Built of brick and stone, often on foundations far too shallow for their eventual height, they leaned and shifted precariously. Builders compensated by thickening the lower walls, sometimes to several meters, leaving the interiors narrow and almost claustrophobic. Servants climbed endless staircases, carrying water in buckets and firewood in bundles, sweating as they ascended spirals that seemed designed to break backs. The noble families themselves rarely touched these burdens. They sat in upper chambers warmed by braziers, sipping wine and congratulating themselves on their superiority, while those who actually kept the fires burning wheezed below in shadow. At night, the lamps turned the towers into symbols of extravagance. Oil was expensive, candles costly, and yet families insisted on burning them high above the rooftops where they provided little practical illumination to anyone. The symbolism mattered more than the light itself. A glowing tower meant wealth, control, and endurance. It whispered to rivals, "We can afford to waste what you must hoard." To ordinary citizens, it was both fascinating and infuriating, like watching someone throw coins into a river simply to prove they could. The glow also changed the way people experienced the city at night. In most medieval towns, darkness was nearly total once the sun set, broken only by torches, hearths, or the rare lantern on a civic building. Bologna, however, had its vertical lights. Travelers wrote of approaching the city after dusk and seeing a cluster of faintly shining pillars in the distance, as though the city itself had grown candles. The towers gave Bologna a kind of nocturnal identity, one that set it apart from other Italian cities. The name Moon Towers was not just poetic but practical. They really did echo the pale presence of the moon, casting a glow that felt uncanny in a world unused to nightlight. Yet, the towers were not only symbols of wealth, they were also hazards. Fires were constant threats, especially when lamps flickered in high windows. Wind could tip flames into curtains, and the height of the structures made it nearly impossible to extinguish a blaze once it began. Falling debris, tiles, bricks, even flaming timbers, sometimes rained down onto streets, crushing or burning those unlucky enough to be below. Families insisted on keeping their towers lit, even when the risk was obvious, because the glow was too important to abandon. Prestige demanded danger. The rivalry among families kept pushing towers higher, but civic leaders grew nervous. By the 13th century, the city government attempted to regulate the height of new constructions, partly to curb danger, partly to reassert civic over private authority. Yet, enforcement was uneven, and the towers continued to rise. The skyline became a testament, not to unity, but to discord. Each noble family competing in masonry, brick by brick, to prove supremacy. The glow at night was less a sign of community than a series of private beacons, flaring into the dark to declare victory in a contest no one ever truly won. Inside the towers, domestic life was practical rather than glamorous. Families cooked in smoky kitchens, stored grain in lower rooms, and huddled in chambers warmed poorly by braziers. The upper rooms offered views and prestige, but little comfort. Servants carried hot food upward only for it to arrive cold. Water spilled as it sloshed along staircases. Children tripped on steep steps in the dark. The glow visible from outside hid the daily inconveniences inside. To outsiders, the towers were luminous. To insiders, they were drafty, creaking monuments to pride. And yet, for all their flaws, the Moon Towers gave Bologna a reputation. Foreign travelers wrote of the city as one of towers. its skyline unmatched in Italy. Some admired the beauty, others mocked the excess. A few compared it to a forest turned upside down, its branches pointing not to the sky, but planted stubbornly in it. Whatever their opinion, no one forgot the sight. The towers, lit faintly at night, burned themselves into memory more effectively than any statue or cathedral. So Bologna lived beneath its strange constellations, stone shafts, lit with trembling flames, glowing faintly in the medieval dark. Families squabbled, servants sweated, citizens grumbled, but the skyline gleamed, unforgettable in its absurdity. The moon towers stood as both pride and folly, a reminder that human ambition always reaches upward, even if it means balancing lamps on precarious stacks of brick. Sliding deeper into the life of Bologna's moon towers, one notices how their glow seeped into the rhythm of the city itself. For most medieval towns, the night was a time of near total darkness, a velvet cloak that brought silence, caution, and an early retreat indoors. Bologna, however, carried a peculiar shimmer, its towers pricking holes in the night. This faint glow reshaped how people thought about the city after sunset, creating both comfort and unease. From the street level, the towers were imposing even in darkness. Narrow alleys wound between high walls, and when the lamps above flickered, the shadows stretched like fingers across cobblestones. Pedestrians walking home late might glance upward, catching sight of trembling flames high in the sky, reminders of the noble families who lorded over them. These lights provided no practical illumination for the streets below. If anything, they highlighted the disparity between the glowing heights and the murky ground. But for those below, the lights were symbols, both reassuring and irritating. They signaled that the city was alive, awake, and watched, even if the watching eyes belonged to families who cared little for commoners' struggles. The towers also influenced how outsiders perceived Bologna's order, or lack of it. Merchants arriving after dark described the city as glittering faintly, unlike most places where night meant stumbling blindly toward a tavern. But they also noted the arrogance of the glow, each lamp belonging not to the city as a whole, but to individual households. Bologna's towers were not street lamps, they were boasts. They lit the skyline but left the streets dark, a perfect metaphor for private power eclipsing public good. Inside the towers, nights carried their own rhythm. Families gathered in upper rooms, the glow from their lamps spilling out of narrow windows into the night. These gatherings were not always peaceful. Feuds between families often spilled into the darkness, with insults shouted from one tower to another, lamps brandished like signals or challenges. It was as if the towers themselves had voices, their glowing windows blinking like angry eyes across the rooftops. Citizens below must have groaned at these spectacles, forced to live beneath families who turned their homes into vertical stages for rivalries that never ended. The practical dangers of the glow never went away. Oil lamps were unstable, their flames easily tipped by wind. Towers built hastily or poorly maintained leaned ominously, some visibly tilting against the skyline. When fire broke out, and it often did, it spread quickly, consuming wood floors and staircases, sending flaming debris tumbling into the streets. Neighbors rushed with buckets of water, but once a tall tower burned, there was little hope of saving it. Bologna's chronicles note collapses with grim brevity, yet one imagines the chaos, stone cracking, families screaming, flames licking into the sky that the lamps once only mimicked. The city government, caught between admiration and alarm, attempted to assert control. Regulations limited new construction, and fines were levied against families whose towers endangered the public. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. as magistrates themselves were often allied with or beholden to the same noble families who owned the towers. Civic pride coexisted uneasily with civic resentment. The towers gave Bologna a reputation, but they also made it fragile. The glow might have impressed travelers, but to locals it was both a blessing and a curse. Still, the moon towers became woven into the identity of the city. Students at the university, which by the 13th century was famous across Europe, used them as landmarks when wandering home after debates and quarrels in taverns. Lovers met under their shadows, arranging secret trysts in alleys, bathed faintly in reflected glow. Priests looked up at them after evening prayers, perhaps seeing in the glow a reminder of the celestial order. Even cynics could not quite ignore them. The towers had become more than buildings. They were symbols stitched into the daily fabric of Bologna's life. The irony, of course, was that the glow that gave them their beauty also revealed their folly. Each lamp burned oil that might have warmed a household hearth. Each candle consumed wax that might have lit a scholar's desk. To keep lamps glowing so high above the city was extravagance of the purest sort. Light deliberately wasted to prove superiority. Families were not trying to illuminate. They were trying to intimidate. Bologna's skyline was a contest written in flame, its towers glowing not for the people but against one another. Yet, perhaps that was the strange genius of the moon towers. In the time when cities were dark, Bologna was memorable precisely because it shimmered. The glow was pointless, impractical, even dangerous, but unforgettable. Travelers carried stories of Bologna's luminous skyline across Europe, spreading its reputation as the city of towers. Even if the light came from rivalry and pride, it cast Bologna in a kind of medieval starlight, a constellation rooted not in the heavens but in brick and oil. And so, Bologna's nights remained unique, its streets dark but its skyline shimmering faintly, its people muttering curses even as they craned their necks upward. The moon towers glowed not for utility but for memory, ensuring that the city's arrogance was also its legacy. Drifting higher into Bologna's skyline, the towers begin to feel less like practical homes and more like declarations chiseled in brick. Each family seemed intent on shouting vertically, their voices carried upward by masonry. The result was a forest of towers, clustered so thickly that some streets lived in perpetual shadow. By night, the glow from lamps high above softened their outlines, turning this thicket of ambition into something dreamlike. Yet the dream was never gentle for those living beneath it. Citizens in the streets had a complicated relationship with the towers. They admired them, certainly. Who could deny the sight of a skyline that glittered faintly when the rest of Europe slumbered in darkness? But admiration soured quickly into irritation. Towers meant danger, loose stones that fell into alleyways, collapsing walls when storms hit, or the ever-present risk of fire from lamps left burning in drafty chambers. And towers meant arrogance. Every flame that shimmered above was a reminder that noble families burned oil for spectacle, while commoners rationed it carefully, saving each drop for cooking or prayer. By day, the towers were stages for rivalry. Neighbors craned their necks, arguing over which stood taller, which leaned more dangerously, which was built on foundations foolishly shallow. Children used them as landmarks, students as meeting points, merchants as metaphors. By night, the glow softened those rivalries into silhouettes. Families might boast endlessly about their towers, but once the lamps flickered on, they were indistinguishable from one another, just tall shafts of stone shimmering faintly in the dark, each trying to outshine the others but blending into a collective constellation. Inside, The towers carried a paradox of prestige and discomfort. Noble families sat in upper chambers surrounded by fine tapestries and braziers. Yet even luxury could not disguise the narrowness of the space. The walls pressed close, the ceilings creaked, and staircases turned every errand into a small ordeal. Servants bore the brunt, climbing endlessly with water, food, and firewood. Their sweat kept the lamps glowing in the night windows, yet their names rarely made it into the chronicles. The glow of the moon towers was not just oil, it was human labor burning invisibly in the shadows. Foreign travelers often wrote about Bologna's towers with a mixture of awe and confusion. Some compared them to minarets, others to trees of stone, others still to a city that had decided to grow vertically instead of horizontally. At night they described the glow as otherworldly, calling Bologna a city of moons, a place where the night sky seemed to have descended into the streets. But even the most enchanted visitors noted the impracticality. These were not civic beacons, not lights to guide the weary traveler or to make streets safer. They were ornaments of rivalry, beautiful in their pointlessness. The city government's discomfort grew as the towers multiplied. Efforts to regulate their construction came too late, and by the 13th century, Bologna's skyline was already crowded with stone needles. Some officials dreamed of tearing them down, fearing that the towers symbolized disorder more than prestige. Yet the Bologna also profited from its reputation. Visitors brought trade and money, drawn in part by curiosity about the city of towers. The government hesitated to dismantle the symbols of arrogance or exploit them for fame. For a time it chose hesitation, and so the towers remained, glowing faintly at night, like jewels set in brick. The glow itself carried meanings that shifted with the observer. For noble families, it was triumph. For commoners, it was insult. For travelers, it was enchantment. And for chroniclers, it was material, something to describe in tones of admiration, skepticism, or outright mockery. In truth, the moon towers were all of these at once: triumph, insult, enchantment, folly. They lit the night, not with clarity but with contradiction. And so, Bologna lived beneath its constellation of rivalry. Families bickered, towers leaned, servants sweated, citizens muttered, and foreigners marveled. The lamps flickered above, trembling in the wind, casting faint halos against the night. The glow did not make the streets safer or the city more united, but it made Bologna unforgettable, and in the medieval world, memory was power enough. Sliding further into the strange brilliance of Bologna's moon towers, one begins to see how they shaped not only the skyline, but the psychology of the city. Towers were no longer just defensive fortresses or family homes. They were obsessions. Each brick stacked higher than a rival's was a point scored in a game of prestige, and each lamp lit at night was a public boast written against the darkness. Bologna did not simply live with its towers, it lived through them. For noble families, the towers were both crowns and cages. To have one was to announce dominance, but to maintain one was an endless burden. Lamps had to be lit nightly, servants dispatched with jugs of oil, staircases climbed again and again to keep the glow alive. Oil was costly, so every flame that flickered from a high window was also a signal of disposable wealth. To leave a tower dark at night was to admit weakness, a humiliation that no proud family wished to endure. Thus, even in times of hardship, lamps were kept burning, because the glow mattered more than the balance of accounts. The servants who carried this burden did not enjoy the symbolism. For them, the towers meant aching legs, bruised shoulders, and long nights spent stumbling up narrow stairs with heavy loads. Oil sloshed, candles dripped, braziers smoked, all for the sake of a light no one below would ever thank them for. If the flames sputtered out too early, the shame fell not on the family, but on the servant, who bore the blame for tarnishing a nobleman's pride. The glow of the moon towers, so admired by travellers, was therefore built on endless, invisible exhaustion. On the ground, the towers cast their own influence. Their glow gave the streets an eerie half-light, not enough to banish darkness, but enough to make shadows sharper. Narrow alleys seemed even more menacing under their intermittent shine. Citizens looked upward constantly, measuring towers against one another, muttering curses at families whose lamps blazed too brightly. The towers dominated not just the skyline, but conversation, gossip, and resentment. They were at once landmarks and irritants, admired and despised in equal measure. The university students who flocked to Bologna from across Europe added their own commentary. Some praised the towers in their letters home, describing them as marvels. Others mocked them, comparing the families to children stacking blocks too proud to stop. Late at night, after taverns had emptied, the glow of the towers became background to drunken debates. Students pointing upward with cups in hand, laughing at the absurdity of so many noble families locked in vertical competition. The moon towers thus became part of student folklore, inspiring both awe and satire. Travellers, too, left accounts tinged with contradiction. A merchant from Germany wrote of Bologna shining like a city of lanterns, its towers glowing like pillars of fire. A French cleric, less impressed, called the towers proud torches of arrogance, accusing Bologna's nobility of wasting light that might have illuminated churches instead. Both were correct, in their own way. The towers were undeniably beautiful, but their beauty was inseparable from their folly. The city government's patience eventually wore thin as the towers grew more numerous and taller. Regulations became harsher. Some towers were ordered reduced in height, others demolished outright. Families protested, but the government argued that too many towers endangered not only lives, but civic order. By the late Middle Ages, the skyline was thinning, and the glow of the moon towers grew less dense. Bologna was becoming a more ordinary city, its eccentric constellation dimming under the weight of practicality. Yet memory lingered. Even as towers were reduced or dismantled, the image of Bologna as a city of glowing pillars endured. Chroniclers still described it as a place where the night sky seemed inverted, where families lit flames high above their rivals, where wealth was measured not in gold but in wasted oil. The towers may have been fewer, but their legend grew larger. Bologna could never quite shake its reputation as the city of moons. And so, night after night, the remaining towers glowed on, their lamps flickering against the dark, their shadows stretching across alleys. The rivalry persisted, even if muted, and the city continued to live under its strange, shimmering constellation. The towers were fading, but their glow still haunted Bologna, reminding citizens of a time when ambition burned as brightly as flame against the night. Sliding still further into Bologna's peculiar skyline, the towers begin to feel less like eccentric luxuries, and more like uneasy monuments to a city caught between pride and fragility. By the later Middle Ages, the great tower race was slowing, but the structures remained, some leaning, some crumbling, many still lit faintly at night, their glow more stubborn than triumphant. What had once been a booming chorus of light now flickered like a handful of stubborn candles clinging to a drafty room. For the noble families, the towers that survived were both relics and burdens. They still symbolized prestige, but the age of one-upmanship was waning, and maintaining them became increasingly impractical. Stone cracked, mortar crumbled, staircases wore thin. Yet to dismantle a tower was to admit decline, and so families clung to their monuments, even as servants grumbled and citizens muttered about falling bricks. The glow from above was no longer dazzling, it was nostalgic, a reminder of an era when Bologna glittered more extravagantly. Servants continued to shoulder the endless labor, carrying oil up 30 or 40 meters of cramped staircases was not romantic, it was grueling. They trudged upward with clay lamps, careful not to spill, lighting wicks in rooms so drafty the flames guttered before they caught. From below, passers-by might admire the glow. Inside, sweat dripped, lungs heaved, and tempers frayed. The moon towers were lovely in concept, but in practice they were monuments to exhaustion. The towers also posed hazards that no amount of admiration could disguise. Their height made them lightning rods during storms, and fires remained a constant risk. Collapses did occur, sudden and catastrophic, bringing down not only stone but the reputation of the families who owned them. Each disaster became the city's gossip, retold in taverns and marketplaces with grim satisfaction. Citizens who had long endured the arrogance of glowing towers could hardly resist Schadenfreude when one cracked and toppled. Pride built upward, humiliation fell downward. Still, Bologna's towers cast their spell on outsiders. Pilgrims and merchants arriving at dusk described the city as shimmering faintly against the Apennine horizon. Even if fewer towers glowed, the effect was striking. A cluster of slender silhouettes pricked with light, like candles gathered on an altar. Foreigners saw wonder where locals saw folly, and so Bologna's reputation continued to travel farther than its oil supply ever could. Memory, after all, does not measure practicality, it measures spectacle. Meanwhile, life in the streets carried on under this odd constellation. The markets bustled by day, crowded with students, traders, and artisans, while at night alleys sank into shadow relieved only by the faint glow above. Children grew up, taking the towers for granted, pointing them out playfully, weaving them into rhymes. Lovers met under their silhouettes, imagining the flames above as omens of fortune. Cynics mocked them as lanterns of arrogance. But even the most jaded citizens occasionally lifted their eyes to the flickering skyline and felt, if not admiration, then at least recognition. The towers belonged to Bologna, absurd and fragile as they were. The university students, ever sharp-tongued, kept the satire alive. They compared the noble families to moths fluttering desperately toward their own flames, consuming oil to keep their pride alight. In taverns, songs mocked the towers as chimneys of vanity, jokes that likely stung their owners more than any city ordinance. Yet the same students, stumbling home late at night, admitted that the glowing towers were useful landmarks, guiding them to lodgings when all else was dark. Even folly can have function. The government's attempts to manage the skyline grew more serious as the centuries passed. Some towers were deliberately reduced in height, others dismantled entirely. Practicality finally began to outweigh prestige. The glow of the moon towers diminished, but Bologna's legend as a city of lighted pinnacles was already cemented. To outsiders, the towers defined the city long after their lamps had dimmed, and so Bologna entered a quieter age of towers, less crowded, less flamboyant, yet still haunted by the memory of its shimmering skyline. The surviving structures glowed less brightly, but they carried history in their shadows. They stood as reminders of a time when families competed not only in wealth and influence, but in light itself. burning oil against the night to prove superiority. Even in decline, the towers shaped how Bologna saw itself: proud, eccentric, fragile, glowing faintly in memory. Their flames trembled, but their story endured, illuminating the city long after the lamps themselves had gone dark, sliding further into Bologna's long twilight of towers. The glow that once screamed of aristocratic rivalry softened into something quieter, almost wistful. The great contests of height were over. The government's interventions and the sheer impracticality of keeping so many stone needles upright had thinned the skyline. Yet a handful remained, stubbornly holding their place above the city, their lamps still lit at night more out of tradition than triumph. For the families who still owned them, these towers had shifted from weapons of rivalry to heirlooms of memory. To light one was to honor ancestors, to keep a lineage's name visible against the dark. The glow no longer declared superiority quite so loudly. It whispered continuity instead. A faint lamp flickering in a high window might not dazzle travelers the way it once did, but it reassured those who lit it that their family still endured, even as fashions and fortunes changed. For servants, the burden remained, though perhaps with less urgency. Carrying oil up spirals of stone was still exhausting, but the ritual had become gentler. Families expected lamps to burn, but fewer neighbors were counting which towers glowed brightest. Pride had dimmed into persistence. The towers were less a contest than a habit, and servants muttered their complaints with slightly less fear. Even so, the glow was never free. It still demanded sweat, oil, and time. In the city below, attitudes had shifted too. Where once the towers were symbols of arrogance, now they began to feel like landmarks of identity. Citizens who had grumbled for centuries now spoke of them with a kind of reluctant pride. They pointed them out to visiting merchants, boasted that Bologna's skyline was unlike any other in Italy, and tolerated their shadows as part of the city's character. Absurd though the towers had been, they had become inseparable from Bologna itself, as much a part of the city's story as its university or markets. Foreign travelers continued to write about them with fascination. By the Renaissance, Bologna's skyline was already thinning, but those who arrived at dusk still noted the odd glow high above. The lamps seemed fragile, quaint even, compared to the grand illuminations beginning to appear in other cities. Yet they carried a charm that could not be denied. To see light so high in a medieval city was still startling, even if it flickered more faintly than before. Bologna's towers had become less boastful and more atmospheric, no longer arrogant moons but gentle lanterns of memory. Yet the danger never entirely disappeared. Towers still leaned, still crumbled, still posed risks in storms. Fires still broke out, sometimes consuming entire upper floors before anyone could respond. Citizens grew more forgiving, however, less quick to curse the towers than in earlier centuries. Accidents became stories of fate, woven into the city's folklore. The tower fell, people would say, shrugging as though it were inevitable, like rain or illness. The glow had shifted from menace to melancholy, from provocation to backdrop. The university students, always quick with irony, adapted their jokes accordingly. No longer mocking families for their arrogance, they teased them for their stubbornness, calling the towers candlesticks of memory or old men leaning on the sky. Songs in taverns still mentioned them, but now with gentler humor, as if mocking an eccentric relative rather than an enemy. The glow of the towers had grown sentimental, softened by the passing of century. By this stage, the moon towers were as much myth as reality. Fewer lamps glowed at night, yet stories of Bologna's luminous skyline grew ever more exaggerated in retelling. Travelers described a forest of glowing spires long after the forest had thinned. Memory outshone the present. The tower's reputation became brighter than their lamps, a constellation preserved not in oil but in imagination. And so Bologna entered a quieter age of towers, their glow faint but persistent. No longer loud with rivalry, they became gentle companions to the night, symbols less of arrogance than of endurance. Citizens walked beneath them with less resentment and more affection, as though the towers, once tyrants of the skyline, had mellowed into guardians of memory. Night after night, the remaining lamps flickered against the dark, their flames smaller, their halos softer, but their meaning richer. The moon towers no longer outshone one another, they outshone time itself, glowing faintly in a city that had learned to live with their folly as part of its soul. And at last, the story of Bologna's moon towers drifts toward its quiet ending. What began as a contest of pride and rivalry, towers stacked brick by brick in a race toward the sky, had by the later centuries become something else entirely: monuments of memory, silhouettes of a past that refused to vanish. Their glow, once flamboyant, faded into something gentler, a faint shimmer lingering in the night like embers of an old fire. The city itself changed around them. Streets widened, new buildings rose, and civic order grew stronger than family rivalry. The great tower race that once defined Bologna gave way to other concerns: trade, scholarship, and the rhythms of daily life in a city known more for its university than its skyline. Yet the towers remained, some leaning precariously, others shortened, many dismantled, but enough still standing to remind everyone of an age when ambition had been written in vertical lines against the sky. The glow of the moon towers, too, lingered in memory long after most lamps had gone dark. Foreigners continued to describe Bologna as the city of glowing towers, even when fewer and fewer lights flickered above its roofs. Travelers arriving at night still found themselves enchanted by the sight of flames trembling in high windows, however sparse. For them, the glow carried not arrogance, but romance, a reminder that even in a world without street lamps, people had found ways to push back the dark, however impractical. The citizens of Bologna grew into a kind of reluctant affection for their towers. What had once been symbols of aristocratic arrogance became part of the city's identity. Children grew up playing in their shadows. Students used them as landmarks. Merchants pointed them out to customers. The towers shifted from irritants to icons. Their glow reframed not as wasted oil, but as stubborn memory. Bologna learned to live with its eccentricity, and in time, even to cherish it. Today, only a fraction of the towers survive, the most famous being the Leaning Esenelli and Garrisenda. Their lamps no longer blaze into the night as they once did, but the legend of the moon towers endures. The idea of Bologna as a city glowing faintly against the medieval dark has become part of its mythology, a story retold by guides and historians, a shimmer preserved in words if not in flame. The towers remind us that cities are shaped as much by folly as by reason, as much by rivalry as by cooperation. The moon towers of Bologna were never practical. They were dangerous, expensive, exhausting, and often ridiculous, but they were unforgettable. They lit the skyline not with generosity, but with rivalry, not for utility, but for spectacle. And yet, in doing so, they gave Bologna a character unlike any other city in medieval Europe. Their glow was arrogance, but also beauty. Their flames were wasteful, but also wondrous. Their fragility was real, but their memory proved stronger than stone. And so, the moon towers endure, if not in their full number, then in imagination. They remind us that history is not only built on monuments of practicality, but also on gestures of extravagance, flickering lights carried high into the night, trembling against the dark, glowing long after their oil has burned away. Bologna's towers may no longer blaze, but their legend still glimmers faint and persistent, like the afterimage of moons that once crowned a medieval city. This story closes, reminding us that every end is only a doorway. Beyond it lies another world, another question, another wonder, waiting to be told. This is the market bells of Edo, daily rhythms in the Shogun city, when the city of Edo swelled into the beating heart of Tokugawa Japan. Its rhythm was not kept by clocks, but by bells. Large bronze bells rang out across districts, calling citizens to rise, to open stalls, to bargain, to close, to rest. In a time before the modern tick of standardized timepieces, Edo's bells were the city's heartbeat, structuring the daily lives of samurai, merchants, laborers, and entertainers alike. The clang of a bell was more than just sound. It was law, ritual, and habit cast into the air. Edo, which would later become Tokyo, grew explosively from the early 1600s onward under Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors. What began as a relatively modest castle town expanded into one of the largest cities in the world by the 18th century, teeming with over 1 million residents. Within its wooden sprawl, markets became the lifeblood of daily existence, and the bells that regulated them were woven deeply into the city's fabric. Warning bells stirred the city awake, signaling when stalls might open. Midday bells marked shifts in activity, while evening bells signaled curfews or closures, nudging Edo into its nightly hush. The bells themselves were enormous, suspended in wooden frames, struck with logs swung on ropes. Their sound carried far, vibrating across rivers and canals, bouncing off the walls of samurai estates and lingering over the shophouses of merchants. Each district had its own bell towers, and though their tones varied, together they stitched the city into a single auditory map. For residents, life was lived by listening. The bell at dawn might tell a carpenter it was time to shoulder his tools, a fishmonger to drag his catch to the market, or a servant to prepare rice for a samurai household. Without glancing at any dial, they knew the bell had spoken. Markets themselves thrived in this ordered chaos. No Humbashi, the great commercial center of Edo, bustled with fishmongers, rice brokers, and cloth merchants, all governed by the rhythm of the bells. In the morning, as the bronze voice of the city rang out, shutters opened and the clatter of trade began. Fish, still slick with sea spray from Edo Bay, flopped onto wooden boards. Rice brokers shouted prices, their voices competing with the creak of carts and the calls of hawkers. The bell had told the city it was time to do business, and so it did, in a flurry of noise and negotiation. For samurai, who lived in regimented quarters closer to Edo Castle, the bells carried a different meaning. They structured duties, parades, and curfews. A bell at evening reminded them when to return to their residences, when lanterns should be lit, when streets were to be cleared of commoners. The clang was not merely a signal of time but of order, reinforcing the Tokugawa regime's obsession with hierarchy and control. Bells in their bronze weight carried the weight of the shogun's authority. Yet for ordinary townsfolk, the bells could feel both comforting and oppressive. They gave predictability to daily life, but they also dictated it. A merchant might wish to keep his stall open late, but the bell said otherwise, and ward officials enforced its judgment. A young couple might linger too long in a tea house, only to be driven out by the echoing clang that demanded curfew. Bells marked not only when to work, but when to stop, when to play, and when to disappear indoors. In Edo, freedom was never entirely free. It was always time. The soundscape of the city was layered. In the morning, the clang of bells mixed with the cries of vendors. Fresh fish, fresh tofu, echoing through wooden streets. In the afternoon, bells competed with the rhythmic chanting of palanquin bearers, the rattle of carts, and the drone of prayers from nearby temples. At night, the bell's toll fell over quieter streets, mingling with the shuffle of night watch patrols and the distant laughter from pleasure quarters. Bells were not isolated events, but part of a symphony of sound that defined the city's identity. For outsiders, Edo's reliance on bells could seem striking. Foreign visitors, rare though they were under the Tokugawa regime, often noted the city's ordered rhythms. Without the mechanical clock culture of Europe, Edo seemed ruled by sound and habit. Its vast population moving in harmony with bronze voices. The bells gave the city a sense of unity, even as its social divisions, samurai, merchants, artisans, peasants, remained sharp. Everyone, high or low, heard the same clang. Everyone, willingly or grudgingly, lived within its rhythm. And yet, bells were also fragile. Fires, the constant terror of Edo, sometimes destroyed bell towers, leaving districts disoriented until replacements were cast and raised. During such times, residents muttered uneasily, as though robbed of their compass. The silence of a missing bell was as unsettling as its sound was reassuring. Bells were not just instruments of time. They were guardians of order. Without them, the city felt unmoored, its rhythms disrupted, its people adrift. So Edo moved through its days and nights, stitched together by sound. Bells called the city to work, to rest, to obey, to survive. They were not merely background noise, but central actors in the daily theater of life, keeping 1 million residents in sync without a single clock tower, schedule printed on paper. The clang was law, ritual, habit, and memory all at once. And so, in the Shogun's city, time itself was bronze, swinging slowly in wooden frames, ringing out over rivers and rooftops, telling everyone when to begin, when to pause, and when to fade into silence. Sliding deeper into Edo's soundscape, the bells emerge not just as keepers of time, but as sculptors of mood. Their resonance carried across the city like a tide, steady and slow, washing into neighborhoods with a weight that was both ordinary and ceremonial. For a city without clocks in every household, the bronze tones were as familiar as the sunrise, a reassurance that the day was unfolding as it should. Morning bells had a particular sharpness. They did not so much invite the city awake as insist upon it. Merchants groaned, servants stirred fires, and fishmongers hurried toward Nihonbashi, where the day's trading would soon roar into motion. Housewives adjusted their schedules to the clang, measuring when to send children with errands or when to fetch water. Before the crowds thickened, a bell did not ask if you were ready. It told you that readiness was now expected. The markets responded instantly. Nihonbashi Bridge, the symbolic and practical heart of Edo, came alive with stalls that seemed to spring open the moment the morning bell faded. Rice brokers raised their flags, signaling that the price of Japan's staple grain was now open for haggling. Porters carried bundles of cloth and crates of fish, their footsteps pounding in rhythm with shouted calls. The clang of the bell lingered as an echo above the din, like a conductor who had already left the stage, but whose presence was still felt in every note. For artisans, the bells marked not only beginnings but pacing. Carpenters adjusted their hours of labor according to the rhythm of the strikes, aware that ward officials might appear if work stretched too far beyond the sanctioned window. Smiths hammered metal in time with both muscle and bell, their sparks flying as though in competition with bronze. Even the quieter trades, such as calligraphers or papermakers, measured their breaks and deliveries according to the tolling. It was not unusual to hear someone say, "I'll finish this by the next bell," as if the instrument were not merely announcing time but setting deadlines. Samurai, too, moved to the bell's cadence. Though their relationship with sound carried more authority than obligation, the bells reminded them when patrols should shift, when castle gates should be shut, when the city should quiet itself for the evening. Their households followed these rhythms with a precision meant to mirror the discipline of the shogunate itself. The clang of bronze was a reminder that order was not optional. It was the foundation of Edo life. A bell was the shogun's voice, echoing through wood and tile. The pleasure quarters, by contrast, bent the bells into something more playful. In Yoshiwara, the famous district of licensed entertainment, the bells still tolled, but their meaning was flexible. Patrons heard the evening bell as a warning that curfews were near, but they also knew that behind the gates, lamps would continue to glow, music would continue to thrum, and the night would spill well beyond what bronze had decreed. The bells, in this way, marked not only obedience, but also resistance, a signal that some corners of Edo chose to live just slightly out of sync. The bells also shaped the city's silence. After the evening toll, streets grew hushed, fires were doused in braziers, shutters closed, and families retreated indoors. Patrols marched, their lanterns glowing faintly, the rattle of their staffs marking presence. The absence of noise was itself a kind of presence, punctuated only by the bell's heavy final strikes. For those awake late, the quiet clang from distant towers could feel like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, a reminder that even in silence the city was awake in its bones. Fires, ever the enemy of Edo, added another layer to this sonic world. Special bells, known as Hinoko bells, rang urgently when flames erupted, their rapid rhythm instantly distinguishable from the measured daily tolls. These alarms jolted households into panic, sending citizens scrambling with buckets and ladders. In a city of wood and paper, the sound of a fire bell froze blood faster than any sight of smoke. The ordinary bells told you how to live. The fire bells told you how to survive. To visitors, this orchestration of life by sound was astonishing. The bells provided a structure that required no written timetables, no printed announcements, no personal watches ticking in pockets. In a city of 1 million people, all one had to do was listen. Edo was less a place of silent obedience than of audible rhythm, a city that breathed in strikes of bronze. The bells united strangers in a shared awareness. A merchant in Nihonbashi, a samurai near the castle, and a beggar by the river all heard the same clang, felt its weight, and adjusted their steps accordingly. And so, day by day, Edo lived in waves of sound. Bells struck, markets opened, fires flared, streets hushed, and lives fell into patterns shaped by bronze. To modern ears, this might seem restrictive, but for Edo citizens it was ordinary. Life measured not by minutes, but by resonance, each toll folding the vast city into one coherent rhythm. Sliding further into Edo's daily rhythms, one notices how the bells became not only signals of time but instruments of hierarchy. The city did not ring with a single neutral voice. Each clang carried a slightly different meaning, depending on who was listening, and each listener filtered it through their station in Tokugawa, Japan's carefully tiered society. Bronze might strike the air equally, but its echoes landed unevenly. For the merchant class, the bells were practical law. The morning toll meant the shutters had to be lifted, wares displayed, and the haggling begun. Midday bells signaled the busiest moments, the point when customers were most likely to stream through markets, and evening bells closed the rhythm with a heavy clang that told them to pack away the day's earnings. To disobey was to risk fines or worse, for inspectors moved through the districts with ears attuned to whether the markets were obeying their cues. The bell was not a suggestion, it was enforcement by sound. For artisans and laborers, the bells were less about commerce than about pacing. A carpenter in his workshop might listen for the second strike after dawn before picking up his plane, his strokes shaving pingwood in cadence with a fading resonance. A smith at his forge might hammer more urgently as the afternoon bell approached, aware that daylight would soon wane and lamps were costly. To them, the bells divided life into manageable segments, breaking an endless cycle of labor into audible pieces. Work ended when the bell told them it ended, not earlier, not later. Samurai, who imagined themselves above such mundane concerns, nonetheless bent to the same sound. Their quarters near Edo Castle followed bells with almost military precision. The clang at dawn meant morning drills, reports, and duties. The evening toll meant curfew and closure of gates. The bronze strikes reinforced hierarchy, reminding samurai and commoner alike that the Shogun's city ran on shared rhythms. In their minds, perhaps, the bells signaled loyalty and discipline rather than obligation. But the outcome was the same. Everyone moved when the bells said move. For women, the bells often structured hidden worlds of labor. A housewife measured her day, not in hours, but in bells. Prepare rice after the first toll. Send children to errands after the second. Tidy household accounts before the evening curfew. In merchant households, women often managed shops, ensuring shutters were opened and closed at the correct signals. Their lives were as much governed by sound as those of their husbands, though the chronicles rarely note it. The clang of the bell echoed even in kitchens and courtyards, its authority reaching into spaces the officials never saw. Children absorbed the rhythm almost unconsciously. They learned when play had to end because the evening bell tolled, when errands had to be run before the midday clang, when the city grew quiet after curfew. For them, bells were both nuisance and comfort. Nuisance because they cut short games, comfort because they meant predictability in a world that otherwise loomed confusing and vast. The bells became part of their education, teaching discipline without books, lessons struck in bronze rather than ink. The bells were also reminders of fragility. Edo was a city forever threatened by fire, and special fire bells could interrupt the daily rhythm in an instant. These were not the slow, heavy notes of ordinary timekeeping, but frantic, rapid clangs that shattered calm and sent neighborhoods into panic. Citizens grabbed buckets, rushed to fire breaks, and scanned the horizon for smoke. In those moments, the regularity of daily bells seemed almost luxurious, a reminder of order lost whenever flames consumed the city's wooden heart. Foreigners who managed to glimpse Edo, whether Dutch traders or occasional envoys, often remarked on this auditory governance. To their ears, the lack of mechanical clocks suggested backwardness, yet the city's coordination astonished them. How could 1 million people live in relative order without individual timepieces? The answer was simple. They listened. The bells made Edo a city of ears as much as eyes. Its citizens did not need to see a clock face. They only needed to recognize the tone of bronze. Yet, the bells were not neutral background noise. They carried weight, even menace. To ignore them was to challenge authority, and to challenge authority was dangerous. A merchant who tried to stretch his hours past the evening toll risked punishment. A reveler caught outside after curfew could be beaten or fined. The bells spoke not only of rhythm, but of control, a reminder that the Tokugawa order reached even into the unseen corners of daily life. Still, for many Inuits, the bells were also comfort. In a city so vast, their clangs knit neighborhoods together, assuring residents that they were part of something larger, that the chaos of markets, pleasure quarters, and samurai processions was anchored by sound. The clang at dawn was a promise that life would continue as it always had. The clang at night was a reassurance that the city would sleep and rise again. The bronze voice carried not only rules, but reassurance, its vibration humming in the bones of 1 million people who lived by it. And so, Edo breathed in bells, its lungs expanding with sound, its days divided into audible chapters. The Shogun's city did not simply hear its bells. It lived within them, every strike a boundary, every clang a pulse, every vibration a reminder that life here was never silent, never unmeasured, never entirely free. Sliding further into Edo's daily cadence, the bells revealed themselves, not only as markers of time, but as a city's very conscience. Their sound was repetitive, predictable, and inescapable, yet within that predictability lay both comfort and constraint. Edo was a place of wooden houses and winding canals, a metropolis perpetually anxious about fire, order, and crowding. The bells stitched these anxieties together into routine, striking the air with reminders that even a sprawling city of 1 million souls could still be made to march in step. Morning bells had a way of cutting through fog and smoke, rattling against tiled roofs and seeping into paper-walled rooms. Merchants woke at their sound, sometimes reluctantly, pulling open shutters while muttering about the rising cost of oil or rice. The clang gave them no sympathy. It declared simply that business must begin. Rice brokers assembled at Nihonbashi, tallying prices, while fishmongers dragged their dripping crates into stalls. The bell itself seemed indifferent to their grumbles. It was only a sound, yet it commanded obedience with more certainty than any written edict. Midday bells carried a different mood. By then the markets were alive, the streets choked with porters, palanquins, and hawkers shouting themselves hoarse. The clang fell over this chaos like a reminder that the city's pulse was deliberate, not random. For artisans in narrow workshops, woodcarvers, papermakers, smiths, the midday toll broke the monotony, a signal to pause, stretch stiff backs, or shared bowls of rice. The clang was heavy, slow, and oddly reassuring, like a heartbeat reminding the body that it was still alive. Evening bells shifted tone again. Their sound was longer, more drawn out, echoing with a weight that pressed on households. Merchants packed up, lanterns were lit in homes, and watchmen prepared their patrols. Children hurried indoors, urged by parents who glanced nervously at the darkening sky. Lovers lingering in alleyways heard the evening bell as both warning and farewell. It was not simply time passing. It was authority insisting that night belonged to order, not to individuals. Curfew was where the bells spoke most sharply. After the final toll, streets were expected to fall quiet. Patrols walked with lanterns, rattling wooden clappers to enforce the silence. A citizen caught wandering too late could claim ignorance, but ignorance was rarely believed. The bell had already spoken, and its authority was final. Edo was a city alive with laughter and commerce, but its nights were meant to be disciplined. In that way, the bells were less instruments of time than instruments of control. their resonance carrying the will of the shogun into every alley. For those who worked the margins of society, the bells created both boundaries and opportunities. Street performers and storytellers timed their acts carefully, knowing that the crowd would scatter at the evening toll. Vendors selling dumplings or skewered fish rushed to earn coins before the kind pushed customers homeward. Even beggars adjusted their appeals, choosing moments just after midday when the clang reminded passers-by that generosity might balance their fortune. The bells shaped not only work and rest, but also survival. Temples and shrines layered their own sounds atop the civic bells. Buddhist temple bells tolled deeper, slower, their resonance lingering like waves, reminding citizens of transience. Shinto shrines rattled with bells of their own, lighter in tone, announcing prayers or festivals. Edo's soundscape was thus polyphonic, the heavy clang of official timekeeping interwoven with religious tones, each voice reminding listeners of different obligations. One was secular law, the other spiritual law, yet both demanded obedience. The bells also marked crisis. When fire broke out, the Hinoko bells rang frantically, their rhythm sharp and rapid, instantly recognizable against the slower daily strikes. These alarms sent people rushing with buckets, forming desperate chains of water that often did little to stop flames racing through wooden wards. Fires were Edo's great terror, and the sound of a fire bell froze citizens more than the sight of smoke. In those moments, the ordinary bells, those that structured trade and curfew, felt fragile, as if their authority could melt in the heat. Still, once the flames were quenched and ruins cooled, the regular clang returned, reassuring citizens that order had been restored, however temporarily. Foreign visitors, when allowed to glimpse this orchestration, found it uncanny. In their letters, they describe Edo as a city ruled by invisible hands, where sound replaced written schedules, and where people seemed bound together by vibrations rather than by visible overseers. They noted that the bells made no distinctions of class in their reach. A samurai in his barracks, a merchant at his stall, a beggar under a bridge, all heard the same clang. Yet they also observed how differently each class responded, filtered through their own duties and fears. The bells unified and divided simultaneously, both communal and hierarchical. In the end, Edo was a city that measured its life not in hours or minutes, but in echoes. Its eyes rose and fell on bronze voices. Its nights folded into silence under their weight. Citizens did not carry time in pockets or glance at watches. They carried it in their ears, in their memory of how many strikes had passed, in the habits formed around the next inevitable clang. The bells were less about precision than about presence, an ever-returning reminder that the city was alive, disciplined and always listening to itself. Sliding deeper into Edo's bronze heartbeat, the bells reveal how thoroughly they intertwined with the city's psychology. They were not only reminders of duty, but also a soundtrack to identity, something that shaped how citizens imagined themselves and their place in the world. To live in Edo was to live with bells, to expect them, to find silence suspicious, to orient one's day around sound rather than sight. Morning clangs were the first voices many heard each day, resonating across paper walls and tatami floors. Merchants pulled on work robes, servants stoked braziers, and children shuffled sleepily into small yards, all guided by that metallic summons. The bell did not ask if the fish had been delivered or the rice polished. It simply commanded that day begin, ready or not. Edo's citizens often joked, quietly, that the bell was stricter than any magistrate, for it never forgot, never slept, never forgave lateness. Nihonbashi Bridge, The city's commercial core was most alive in those early hours after the bells. Brokers in tall wooden offices tallied grain prices on abacuses, their clerks scribbling figures while shouting updates to runners who dashed into the markets. Fishmongers arranged their slippery wares, the smell of salt water rising as gulls circled above. Cloth sellers unfurled bolts of indigo-dyed cotton, their fingers running along the weave as though it were a promise. The bells had spoken, and the market answered, a chorus of human voices swelling over bronze echoes. Yet, the bells were not always welcome. For artisans and laborers exhausted from long days, the evening toll could feel like a cruel cut. Work left unfinished had to be abandoned, even if the commission was urgent or the wage depended on one more hour of chiseling, hammering, or stitching. A carpenter halfway through fitting a beam might sigh and set down his plane, muttering at the bell as if it were a person. The clang was a law that could not be argued with, its authority unshaken by human need. For women running households, the bells often became private tyrants. The morning toll demanded breakfasts ready before husbands or masters stirred. The midday clang signaled when children should return from errands, when meals had to be on the table, when laundry should already be drying in courtyards. The evening toll sent families indoors, mothers shepherding children back into narrow houses with the same urgency as patrolmen. Bells carried through kitchens and gardens as forcefully as through markets and barracks, structuring unseen domestic rhythms as tightly as public ones. The curfew bells, especially, pressed heavily on Edo. After the final toll, streets were meant to empty, shutters to close, lamps to dim. Patrols with lanterns and rattling clappers walked through wards, enforcing silence. Citizens caught wandering might plead with excuses, illness, urgent errands, lost time, but the bell's authority was unyielding. The city's nights were not owned by its people. They were leased from the shogunate, bounded by bronze. For some, the silence after curfew was reassuring. For others, it was suffocating, a reminder that even the dark was not entirely free. Still, not all obeyed so strictly. In Yoshiwara, the licensed pleasure quarter, the bells tolled just as loudly, but inside its gates the rhythm bent. Patrons ignored the evening clang, slipping through lantern-lit alleys where shamisen strings and laughter drowned out bronze. Courtesans and entertainers lived by another clock, one measured in coin and candlelight. For them, the bells were less commands than markers of contrast, the outside world growing silent as their world grew loud. Edo's discipline, like its paper walls, was strong but never absolute. The bells also played a role in ceremony. Festivals often began with the tolling of special bells, their tones layered with drums and flutes, transforming order into celebration. In those moments, the familiar clang was reinterpreted, not a command to obey, but an invitation to rejoice. Citizens who usually muttered at the sound now cheered, following its echo toward parades, lanterns, and stalls. The same bronze that dictated curfew could, on special days, signal freedom, pleasure, and noise. But perhaps the bell's most haunting role was in fire. Ido's wooden expanse burned often, and the fire bells struck in frantic, unmistakable rhythm. Their sound was thinner, sharper, and quicker than daily tolls, an auditory panic that jolted residents awake at any hour. Families gathered possessions into bundles. Neighbors ran toward fire breaks with buckets, and watchtowers scanned the horizon for smoke. Citizens often remembered such alarms more vividly than the regular bells. They were the sound of life disrupted, the clang of terror. To hear a fire bell was to feel one's heart pound in rhythm with its strike. And yet, after flames were doused and ruins cooled, The ordinary bells resumed, as if nothing had happened. Their heavy notes told the city to begin again, to resume markets, to rebuild homes, to return to routine. In that way, the bells became symbols of resilience as much as control. Edo burned, but Edo's bells always returned, their resonance steady against chaos. Thus, the bells stitched together commerce, armies, duty, celebration, and crisis. They were neutral in tone, yet full of meaning, impartial in sound, yet heavy with power. Edo's citizens grumbled, obeyed, and occasionally resisted, but none escaped. The city's life was not simply measured by bells. It was lived within them, each clang a wall, each silence a corridor, each resonance a reminder that in Edo, time itself belonged to bronze. Drifting further into Edo's soundscape, one begins to see how the bells created not only order but also texture, a kind of shared music that bound strangers together. 1,000,000 people lived inside those rhythms, and though their lives were sharply divided by class and duty, they all recognized the same clangs, the same patterns echoing through wooden streets. The bells were universal in reach, if not in meaning. Morning bells were sharp and purposeful, almost brisk in tone, as though designed to cut through sleep and fog at once. They startled dogs into barking, startled roosters into crowing too late, startled citizens into motion. The sound bounced off canals and rooftops, giving the impression that the whole city woke at once. Merchants and porters responded with urgency, dragging goods towards stores. Housewives hurried to prepare rice for breakfasts, before husbands or masters grew impatient. The bell was the city's alarm clock, but without the option of pressing it quiet again. Midday bells felt different, less insistent and more reflective. Their notes seemed to hang longer, resonating through markets already roaring with voices. The clang fell into the chaos of bargaining, the smell of grilled fish and fresh tofu mixing with wood smoke. Carpenters and smiths paused to wipe sweat from their brows. Children returned from errands with sticky fingers from sweets, and priests muttered prayers between chants as the sound rolled across temple courtyards. For a moment, all ears tilted toward the bronze, as though the city itself bowed its head in acknowledgement. The evening bells, slow and heavy, felt more like warnings. They stretched long into the dusk, echoing across lantern-lit alleys, reminding everyone that playtime was ending, that shutters must soon close. Citizens heard those tones with mixed feelings. Some welcomed them, eager for rest after long days, while others muttered curses at being hurried indoors when conversations, games, or drinks had barely begun. The bell did not care for moods. Its voice carried the weight of law, not sympathy. Curfew bells cast the city into hush. Their toll was final, lingering over emptying streets as patrols rattled wooden clappers to enforce obedience. Lamps dimmed, paper shutters slid shut, and alleys sank into silence. Only the faint rustle of night patrols or the distant murmur from Yoshiwara broke the quiet. For ordinary households, the curfew bell was both safety and suffocation. Safety in that the city slept under order, suffocation in that the order belonged to others. The bell's weight pressed on the roofs like an invisible ceiling. Yet, even in silence, not all obeyed. Lovers lingered a little longer in shadows. Gamblers shuffled dice in hidden rooms. Storytellers whispered tales in tea houses that pretended to have closed. The bell defined the line between order and defiance, and its echo made small acts of resistance feel sharper. To ignore it was dangerous, but to obey it too strictly was to surrender joy. Citizens learned to live in the gray spaces between clangs, bending law without breaking it. The bells also wove themselves into memory. Edo shouts marked milestones, not by dates, but by which bell had tolled. A birth might be recalled as just after the evening bell. A death might be described as between the fire bell and the curfew. Bells became the calendar of memory, a shared system of reference that made the city's sprawling mass feel intimate. To speak in bells was to speak in the language of Edo itself. Fires, when they came, shattered this rhythm with terrifying clarity. The fire bells clanged fast and urgent, cutting across the familiar tones like panic, breaking into a lullaby. Their sharp rhythm sent citizens into instant motion, grabbing children, hauling water, bundling possessions. The sound was unmistakable, and it drilled into the heart with cold certainty. The city was burning again. Everyone knew the drill, and everyone feared the sound. In those moments, the ordinary bells, the ones that structured markets and curfews, felt like a luxury of calmer days. Foreigners who described the city often focused on this auditory order. They marveled that a place so large and so combustible could function without the mechanical clocks common in Europe. The bells, they noted, were both practical and symbolic, uniting citizens in a way that written schedules or posted notices never could. The clang of bronze crossed class lines, piercing into the barracks of samurai, the kitchens of merchants, the alleys of beggars alike. No one could claim ignorance, for everyone heard the same sound. The bells were as democratic as they were authoritarian, and in this way, Edo lived within its bronze cage, comforted, restrained, soothed, and commanded by sound. The city did not simply measure time, it inhaled it, exhaled it, and shaped its life around its vibrations. The clang was as constant as the tides in Edo Bay, as defining as the castle walls, as intimate as a lullaby. Without the bells, Edo would not have been Edo. It would have been silence, disorder, and drift. With them it became a city of rhythm, one whose heartbeat could be heard in every alley, every rooftop, every restless ear. Sliding further into the daily cadences of Edo, the bells begin to feel less like background noise and more like the city's very skeleton. They held its bones in place, invisible but undeniable, so that even when people forgot themselves in the bustle of markets or the quiet of courtyards, the clang would return to remind them where they stood in time and in hierarchy. Morning clangs had their own kind of authority, short, clear, and impatient, as though shaking citizens from futons with no room for excuses. Children trudged to lessons with slate boards tucked under arms. Merchants fussed over their wares, and boatmen on the Sumida River pushed off with poles, their shouts echoing against water just as the bell's vibrations did. The sound had no gentleness, it declared, with the certainty of stone striking bronze, that the day was beginning, whether one liked it or not. As the day wore on, the bells folded themselves into the chaos of Edo's soundscape. The mid-afternoon toll seemed to sigh into the air, reminding weary workers that daylight was thinning, for porters staggering under crates, for apprentices sweeping wood shavings from shop floors. The clang was both relief and reprimand. It meant they had survived half the day, but it also meant there was still half left to endure. Edo's bells did not flatter. They simply stated, again and again, that time was moving forward with or without one's consent. Evening bells carried more weight, sinking into the city like a lid sliding onto a box. Lanterns flickered to life in windows, shutters creaked closed, and conversations on street corners dissolved into hurried goodbyes. Samurai households treated the evening bell as command, not suggestion. Curfews tightened, gates locked, and discipline rehearsed. Merchants packed away goods, already calculating tomorrow's trades. For children, the bell was often the cruelest of teachers, silencing games of tag or marbles with a tone too heavy to argue against. The curfew bells, slow and deliberate, rolled through Edo with a finality that pressed on the skin. Patrols with lanterns and clappers followed, their presence more symbolic than effective, for most citizens had already retreated indoors at the bell's command. The silence that followed was uneasy, rather than peaceful. The city was quiet, not because it wished to be, but because it had been told to be. In that hush, every creak of wood and every whisper behind shutters felt amplified, as though the city itself were holding its breath under bronze authority. Yet, in Yoshiwara, the pleasure quarter, the bells were treated with a wry disdain. Patrons joked that the evening toll was a suggestion for the rest of it, but a starting gun for their shamisen strings. Laughter and the faint clink of sake cups rose in defiance, weaving a counterpoint to the silence outside the gates. Courtesans and entertainers marked time differently, by candles burning low and by coin exchanged, not by bronze clangs. The bells were still heard, of course, but they became ironic reminders of the order from which Yoshiwara promised escape. The bells were also bound to memory in subtle ways. Citizens marked their own lives through them, recalling events not by numbered hours, but by sonic landmarks. It was born after the evening bell, one might say, or the fire started between the midday and curfew bells. Weddings, funerals, and misfortunes were all tucked into the folds of bronze, their chronology preserved by vibration rather than ink. Even years later, people remembered the sound that had hung over their turning points, as though the bells themselves had witnessed their lives. The fire bells remained the sharpest in memory. The Dwights dreaded their rapid rhythm, a frantic staccato unlike any other. At their sound, families dropped everything to prepare, possessions bundled, water buckets grabbed, prayers muttered toward shrine. In those moments, the city's normal bells seemed suddenly precious, their steady tones remembered fondly as symbols of calm. The fire bells, by contrast, were panic itself, telling the city not when to work or sleep, but when to flee. Foreigners, who occasionally observed Edo, described the bells with a kind of astonishment. To them, accustomed to mechanical clocks and town halls, the idea of a city governed by sound seemed strange. Yet, they could not deny the effect. Edo, they wrote, was alive with a rhythm that transcended walls and language, uniting its people in a shared awareness of time. They noted, too, that the bells were impartial in their reach. A noble samurai and a poor porter both tilted their heads to the same sound, even if they interpreted it differently. Bronze did not distinguish rank, it simply rang. In the end, the bells were both discipline and comfort. They could feel like shackles, cutting short pleasures or forcing labor, but they could also feel like anchors, holding the vast and combustible city together. Edo's citizens might mutter at their tones, but they could not imagine life without them. Silence in a city so dependent on bronze would have been worse than command. It would have been chaos, and so the bells endured, swinging in wooden frames, their voices carrying across water and rooftops, their echoes carving the days into shapes everyone recognized. They gave Edo not precision, but rhythm, not freedom, but order, not individuality, but unity. To live there was to live inside their sound, every clang a reminder that the city breathed, listened, and held itself together by bronze. And at last, the bells of Edo settle into their final resonance, less as instruments of command and more as echoes of a vanished world. For centuries they had structured the city's life, their bronze weight swinging in wooden frames, their sound rolling over canals and streets, telling citizens when to wake, when to trade, when to hush, and when to hide. In their constant repetition they became invisible, so familiar that their absence was almost unthinkable. Yet time, which they once ruled, eventually passed them by. As the 19th century advanced, Edo began to transform. Foreign ships appeared in its harbors. Steam engines and mechanical clocks crept into its streets, and the steady bronze cadence that had once defined its rhythms began to sound old-fashioned. Citizens still listened. Of course, the bells still tolled from temples and watchtowers, but other measures of time were arriving, more precise, less forgiving. Watches ticked in pockets, factory whistles blared, and bells that once commanded an entire city now competed with metal machines that never lost their beat. But in memory, the market bells endured as the truest rhythm of the Shogun's city. They were remembered as voices that unified a million people without ink or paper, without schedules or posters, without the clatter of gears. Their authority was not mechanical but human, a sound understood instinctively, its meaning unquestioned. To recall Edo was to recall its bells' bronze voices tolling across a city of wood and water, stitching together chaos with vibration. For merchants, the bells were remembered as the heartbeat of Nihonbashi, the clang that summoned shutters to open and stalls to fill with fish, rice, and cloth. For artisans, they were the measure of work days, the punctuation marks between hammer strokes and brush strokes. For samurai, they were echoes of discipline, reminders that loyalty to the shogunate was heard as much as seen. For women in households, they were unseen overseers, demanding meals ready, chores timed, and children indoors. For children, they were simply the sounds of endings and beginnings, cues to run, play, or retreat. The bells also endured in the darker corners of memory. Fire bells, frantic and sharp, were recalled with dread, their sound synonymous with ruin. Citizens never forgot the nights when those clangs ripped them from sleep, forcing them to flee into streets choked with smoke. To live in Edo was to live with the certainty that fire would come again, and the bells would always be the first to warn. Their voices were woven into survival itself. Even the pleasure quarters carried echoes of the bells in memory. Patrons of Yoshiwara remembered them as ironic companions to revelry, curfew bells clanging just outside, while shamisen strings and laughter continued inside. For them, the bells symbolized the city's duality, strict order and illicit escape, discipline and indulgence, bronze outside and candlelight within. When Edo became Tokyo in the Meiji era, the bells slowly fell silent, their authority replaced by clocks, calendars, and schedules imported from abroad. Yet their memory lingered, whispered in chronicles, evoked in nostalgic poems, recalled in the oral histories of families. To speak of old Edo was to speak of its soundscape, of a city where time was not seen, but heard, where every clang carved the day into shapes familiar and binding. The bells of Edo remind us that time is not only a measure, but an experience. In the Shogun's city, time was heavy, resonant, and communal. It was lived in echoes, felt in vibrations, remembered in tones that could not be ignored. Even in their silence today, the bells still ring in imagination, their sound carrying across centuries, faint but persistent, like the heartbeat of a city that once listened together. And so, dear wanderers, our tale comes to a close. Until next time, may your night be quiet and your dreams be kind. Good night.